Welcome to the Develop Great Managers podcast, where you can learn directly from the experts. I'm Dale Ferrario, your host. For more information and valuable insights, go to developgreatmanagers.com. Now, on to the show. Hi, and welcome back to this week's Develop Great Managers podcast. This week, I think I have a really interesting topic for you. It's called Confident Verging on Cocky, Evolution versus Revolution. And the reason I came up with this podcast is I had one of my listeners who sent me a question. And let me tell you exactly what he asked me for. He said, I would really like to know more about future predictions of top industry trends and how leaders make key decisions for their organizations and spend a good amount of time with their leaders to identify the next big thing to invest in. So that's really what he asked about. Now, that's a huge topic. I'm not going to be able to cover that complete topic. So what I want to do is I want to narrow that down a bit. And I want to talk about how important it is for great leaders to evolve the company, to evolve their processes, to continue to get better and better at what they do. And I want to talk about how a very few great managers come up with revolutionary new ideas. Revolutionary ideas that just dramatically change the company and the industry. So first, let me give you a definition. Evolution is defined as gradual change, adaptation, progression, metamorphosis. Revolution, on the other hand, is defined as forcible overthrow for an entirely new system. Drastic, disruptive, far-reaching, and monumentous change. So the best way to talk about these is to talk about a couple of examples. And I'll talk about examples that are both evolutionary and revolutionary. So let's first talk about sewing. No, I don't sew, but my wife sews. And I have a good understanding of what it takes to be able to hand sew things. Well, it turns out for years and years, needles continued to go through kind of an evolutionary change from pieces of wood to bone to metal. Now that evolutionary change made needles better and better and better over time. But as you can see, it was very evolutionary. As new materials were found or new materials were available, they made needles out of them. And then came the sewing machine. Now the sewing machine dramatically changed how people sewed. It allowed a single seamstress to increase the amount of sewing that she could do in a day dramatically. It applied technology that had evolved elsewhere, but used it for sewing. So there's two different cases, one that's evolutionary and one that's revolutionary. The next topic I want to talk about is the internet. Now, the internet dramatically changed things. I would say that the internet was a revolutionary new technology. It revolutionized a number of things. Let me just talk about one of those. It really revolutionized commerce. Banks can now transact commerce using an open internet almost instantaneously. You can go online and you can buy products. You can do all sorts of different commerce transactions on the internet in ways that were never possible before. So the internet is a great example of a revolutionary change. Next one I want to talk about is computer versus human in gaming. So this is a really cool area, but let me talk about something that maybe a lot of you haven't even heard of or haven't thought about. And that was when they taught a computer to play chess, but not just to play chess, but to beat some of the best chess players in the world. Now the way they did that was they actually taught the computer how to do different moves. The computer would actually sort of think ahead a number of moves and determine for every possible move that could be made, which one is the best move to make, which one has sort of the highest value, and that's the move it would take. Now this is a pretty significant change, but in my mind, it's an evolutionary change. The reason I say it's evolutionary is because they took exactly the game and taught the computer or programmed the computer to know how to do each different move. And it used kind of a very brute force way to say, if I made this move, what are all the moves that the other team or the other person could make? Now, in a way, that's actually how humans think about chess. They think ahead. They may know some patterns, but they do think ahead and understand which moves have which moves that could be countered and how they'll play back and forth. So anyway, I think that that's an evolutionary type of a game. Chess against a human, very evolutionary. Now let me talk about a very different program. And that program is called AlphaGo. Now AlphaGo is a program that learned how to play Go. Now Go is a little bit different. Actually, the board and the moves are incredibly simple. But what's more complicated is how you decide the strategy that you're going to play in order to win the game. So what they did with AlphaGo that's different than what they did with Deep Blue is they didn't teach AlphaGo every possible move that you can make. Like I said, the moves are simple and the board is simple. They really taught AlphaGo what the rules are and what does it mean to be able to win. You end up having to have at least one more space that you've controlled on the board than your opponent. So what's really interesting is how they taught AlphaGo to play. They had AlphaGo play against a bunch of amateurs that had made video recordings of their matches. They gradually taught AlphaGo through sort of machine learning and artificial intelligence how to do better than those competition. Then they started to have AlphaGo play against itself. And it could play many games over and over and over and try different moves and different strategies and really develop its own way to play Go. So now when they had AlphaGo play against a human and they had AlphaGo play against the best Go player in the world, everyone who got to watch this saw AlphaGo make moves that no human had ever made. They didn't really even understand why AlphaGo was making the moves that they did. So when I think about AlphaGo, I think of this as a revolutionary new type of a game, a new way to teach the game how to play, or a new way to teach the computer how to play the game. So I think of that as revolutionary. I'm going to give a personal example as well. And this was my last role while I was at VMware. And I had responsibility for really rethinking, reinventing the way we supported our customers. Now this was a little tricky because while we had fallen behind in using some of the latest technologies, we had a great Net Promoter Score. Our Net Promoter Score was the best in the industry. So while we needed to transform, we needed to reinvent the support model, we needed to be very careful not to break what already worked. So I came up with really 4 different areas that we needed to focus on. The first one was, rather than waiting for a customer to call us when they had a problem, we wanted to find a way to be proactive. We wanted to find a way to call them before they ran into a problem. The second thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to revamp all of the underlying systems to take advantage of the very latest in technology, the latest in features. The third thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to change the way customers interacted with us. We wanted to make sure that they could interact with us through whatever channel or whatever means was most comfortable to them. And the fourth thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to change where they came to look for support. Rather than going to a website, we wanted them to go directly into the tool or the product that they were using and get their support there. Those 4 things were really what our focus was around reinventing the support model. But if you look at all of those, most of those are actually evolutionary. They're evolutionary changes. They're logical changes from what we were doing in the past. The only one that's more revolutionary than evolutionary was moving from reactive support to proactive support, was to use data that we had collected from customers' environments to identify an issue before they ever ran into it. So even though I was driving a large set of changes, most of those changes were evolutionary and only one was revolutionary. So now that I've covered some examples of the difference between evolutionary and revolutionary, let me dig in deeper to evolution and evolutionary change. And the thing I want to talk about here is, as managers develop, actually as anyone develops through their career, they start out by learning sort of one area and they become knowledgeable and an expert in that area. And then they may learn a larger area and then a larger area again, or maybe two different areas that they start to understand and learn. So their scope continues to grow. As that scope continues to grow, they get to the point where they might be able to look at ways where things can be done differently in one of those areas that they understand, or maybe across a couple different areas that they understand. So as they progress, maybe from first level manager to second level manager to director and so on, their scope continues to grow. Now, what happens is the best managers are always looking for ways to do things better, to be more effective, to be more efficient. So when I say, what do great managers do? Great managers find ways to make evolutionary change that makes the company more efficient, more effective, lower costs, drive more revenue. Those are the kinds of things that great managers do. And it's not just a part of your job. It's what distinguishes, like I said earlier, the best managers from the rest of the managers. So most of what great managers do is continue to drive this evolution. Some of those evolutionary changes are simple. They might be completely under your control and you can just make those changes. Maybe it's small process changes. But as you grow in your career and you have larger scope, the changes that you might want to drive are going to require you to convince other people and bring them along and get them to engage and help you to drive that change. That's going to take all of the skills that you've developed as a manager to make that happen. You might need to work with IT on some of that. You might need to work with a different organization on part of it. You might need to convince finance that you need funding for that. These are challenging, but you have to make sure that you don't let those get in your way, that you continue to drive forward and drive those evolutionary changes, because that's what the company needs from you. That's what the company expects. It'll take your selling skills. It'll take you building relationships. It'll take you working through issues, making changes, and driving that change and demonstrating that you have the ability to drive those evolutionary changes. That's what's going to separate the good managers from the great managers. Now let me talk about revolution. Now, revolution isn't something that every manager will do. As a matter of fact, most managers never get to drive a revolutionary change. And that's actually okay. We need managers to be great at what they do. We need them to manage their teams. We need them to drive those evolutionary changes. We need them to make sure that the company is optimal in how they're spending their resources and drive as much revenue as possible. But if you're interested in being a revolutionary leader or a revolutionary manager, here's a bunch of attributes that I think you need to consider in getting yourself ready for that. So the first one is have a vision. The way to do a revolutionary change is often you have to think outside of the box. You have to think differently. You have to have a vision for how things could be. You have to be able to paint that picture, especially for other people around you. But the more clarity you can get in your vision, the more likely it is that you will be able to drive that revolutionary change. So I have a great quote that I put in the blog post about this. And I put the quote in there because it made me think about John F. Kennedy and the space race. And what he said was, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Now that is a great vision. And it just so happened that we managed to achieve that. And a lot of that was him painting that picture and getting people aligned behind it. So the next thing that I think is important is understand future trends. In order to make many of the revolutionary changes, it is because we've been able to apply something that's newly developed to a problem, to a specific area. For example, applying machine learning to support. that allows you to do things dramatically differently. So I think it's incredibly important as a leader and a manager who's looking to drive revolutionary changes, you need to understand those future trends. You need to pay attention to them, and you need to always be thinking about how can I apply that to my challenge or to my problem or to my opportunity. And if you do that, that's also one piece of the puzzle in helping you to become a revolutionary manager. The next one on the list, unwilling to settle. And what I mean by that is making a revolutionary change is hard. You're going to run into so many challenges along the way. You're going to run into people who don't believe it can be done. You're going to run into people who are concerned that if it does happen, what is it going to mean to them and their job or their team? So you have to be willing to just continue to stick with it, go after it. You can't settle for anything less than getting to your vision. You really need to be tenacious. So a couple of years ago, I watched an Academy Award nominated film called The Imitation Game. And that was about Alan Turing building his Turing machine or building his code-breaking machine. Now, if you watch that movie, you saw how many times they continued to run into problems, how much tenacity it took for them to stick with it and actually solve the problems and make that machine work. As time went on, there were so many people that didn't think it would ever happen. But he and his team stuck with it and made it happen. And as a result, there's a good chance that helped us to win the war. Another really good example is Uber and the persistence and tenacity of Travis Kalanick, who was the original founder and CEO. He ran into issues every step along the way. He ran into issues with unions. He ran into issues with cities. He ran into issues with safety. He ran into issues with privacy. Those issues took so much effort to just mow them down one at a time and continue to drive the company forward. He would not settle for the status quo. He knew there was a better way. He had a vision for it, and he made it happen. Now, the next one on my list is a little different, and I call it avoid the details. So that might sound a little bit confusing, so let me try to explain. As a manager, you absolutely need to know what your team is doing. You need to understand it to the level that you can support them. You need to help them and work through issues. You need to show compassion. You need to be there for them. At the same time, you have to be very careful. In driving a revolution, there are so many details that are going to have to be worked that if you suffer and struggle over every single one of those details up front, you'll never get started. So in this case, I think a lot about SpaceX. And can you imagine the number of issues that are in the way of building a reusable rocket? That's just a crazy idea. It's something no one had ever done before. How many people would have said it can't be done? Or how many details did they have to work through in order to make it happen? I remember the first time I saw 2 of the rockets landing back down on Earth so that they could be reused. That was amazing to me. I had never seen anything like that before. The number of challenges they had to overcome to make that happen is mind-boggling. To understand those details up front might have been so overwhelming that you never would have gotten started. So I think you have to be careful and you have to avoid the details when you're going after a revolutionary change. I just want to close on this one with a quote from Elon Musk. If one can figure out how to effectively reuse rockets, just like airplanes, the cost of access to space will be reduced by as much as a factor of 100. A fully reusable vehicle has never been done before. That's really the fundamental breakthrough needed to revolutionize access to space. I just think it's super cool. And I think it's amazing what they've done, and they're on their way to completely reusable rockets. Next one on the list is bring a different perspective. It's easy to sort of get into a mode where you have the same perspective as everyone else. And when you're in that mode, it's really hard to think really differently. It's hard to come up with these revolutionary ideas. So you either have to be able to think differently, or sometimes it's nice to bring in somebody who's actually got a completely different perspective. And when they come in, everything is new to them. They can question everything. They can come up with some new ideas that may just seem impossible to someone else. So bring that different perspective. Now, I have a quote from Henry Ford that I love, and you've probably all heard before, but I think it's so fitting for this one. And that quote is, "If I had to ask people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse." So the people that were originally buying horse and buggy, that's what they thought was important. It took somebody with a very different idea to say, that's not what you really want. You want a car. And that was revolutionary. And the last one is, listen to others. Great ideas, especially those that are revolutionary, often come from combining a number of ideas together. And the best way to get those ideas is to listen to others. Spend the time with them. Ask questions, bounce ideas off of each other, and continue to grow your pool of ideas from which you can develop a revolutionary idea. So let me go back to the example I gave earlier about my last job at VMware. Now, the first thing I did was not come up with that list of 4 things that we needed to do to reinvent support. What I did instead is I spent a lot of time with the people in the organization. I sat down and I watched them do their jobs. I looked at the tools that they were using. I looked at the data that we had available. I talked to other people about what could we do differently. And honestly, the ideas that came out of all of that combined together, they didn't come from me. I was just able to sort of assemble those ideas into something that allowed us to completely reinvent support. Even from a reactive to proactive support model, there was already a small project underway to try some of those ideas out. And so by pulling all those pieces together, all those great ideas from different people in the organization, I was able to formulate a set of steps, a set of projects that allowed us to reinvent support. So to me, gathering those ideas from others, having those conversations, one of the best things that you can do. Next one on the list, comfortable with risk. Every single one of these ideas that I've talked about, the big audacious ideas, the revolutionary ideas, they're fraught with risk. It's unlikely they're going to work. There are so many issues along the way that could derail you. There are people that can derail you. There's risk at every turn. But you have to make sure that you just work your way through it. I really think this is one of the biggest reasons why people don't end up coming up with these revolutionary ideas. I think they're nervous. I think they're worried about the risk. You just have to let that go. You got to get comfortable with it. So let me give you a quote from T.S. Eliot that I really think is fitting in this area. Only those who will risk going too far can possibly find out how far it is possible to go. I love that. So to drive a revolutionary idea forward, you must have a very different perspective on failure. When you do, you're willing to do everything you can to succeed. But when you fail, you'll learn from it and move on. And now the last one, and it's the one that helped create the title for this podcast, Confident, Verging on Cocky. I really think that in order for you to drive these kinds of ideas forward, you have to be incredibly confident. You're going to have to deal with risks. You're going to have to deal with all sorts of issues. You're going to have to sell your ideas. You're going to have to convince people. You're going to have to convince people to follow you, to support you, to help you. Every step of the way, your confidence has to remain. It has to be there. And people have to feel it. If they feel you starting to waver, they're going to start to waver. And the reason I say it's confidence verging on cocky is that you just have to sound so confident that some people are going to say that person is cocky. And I think that that's okay. Be careful, because if you just sound like you're cocky and you don't have enough knowledge behind it and you don't have enough thinking behind it, you're not going to get the support that you need. But I think in order to keep the team with you, other people working with you, mowing down those issues along the way. You have to have that confidence, very strong confidence. So there you go. In conclusion, let me go back and talk about evolution. Evolutionary change is the key to long-term success for companies. Great managers need to get great at driving evolutionary change. Revolutionary change, on the other hand, depends on ideas that are based on a different vision of the future, one that breaks the status quo. Most managers actually won't come up with these ideas, but like I said, that's okay. If you want to be one of those people who does, think about the different areas I've talked about. Make sure that you have a vision. Understand future trends. Be unwilling to settle. Avoid the details. Bring a different perspective. Listen to others. Be comfortable with risk, and make sure that you're confident, verging on cocky. Now, while you do this, you got to remember, to be a great manager, you still have to be a great manager. So I just wanted to give you a list again, and this came from an article I wrote earlier about the attributes that I think are incredibly important for you to continue to be a really good manager while you're looking for ways to be revolutionary. And that is, be a good coach. Empower your team. Avoid micromanaging them. Create an inclusive team, showing concern for success and well-being. Produce results. Communicate, and communicate means listen and share. Have a clear vision for your team. Have a clear strategy for your team, and share that. You need to have enough technical skills that your team is going to be comfortable with you leading them. Collaborate across the company. Make decisions. Don't delay. Make decisions as quickly as you can accurately do that. Be honest. Develop trust. And innovate. So one last quote to wrap all of this up, and this one also comes from Alan Turing. Sometimes it's the people no one can imagine anything of who do the things no one can imagine. Thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard, there are more podcasts available on developgreatmanagers.com, on iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have time, please post a comment, or better yet, please write a review. Talk to you in the next podcast.